A cruel billionaire was known for mistreating his staff, particularly his long-serving black maid. At a lavish party, he publicly humiliated her in front of his guests. His son, disgusted by the behavior, secretly ordered a DNA test that revealed a shocking truth. The maid was actually the billionaire's twin sister, separated during a hospital fire decades ago. Now the truth about their past threatens to destroy his empire and reputation forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Grand Regency Hotel shimmered, a gilded cage reflecting the city lights. Inside, Reginald Worthington, a man whose wealth was only surpassed by his cruelty, held court. His laughter, sharp and brittle as shattered glass, echoed through the opulent ballroom. Clara, her face a mask of practiced composure, moved silently through the throng, a phantom in a sea of silk and champagne. The scent of lilies, cloyingly sweet, did little to mask the underlying stench of power and privilege. Tonight, she served caviar, her hands trembling ever so slightly beneath the pristine white gloves. Reginald, oblivious to her silent suffering, gestured grandly, his diamond cufflinks flashing. He barked orders, his voice a whip cracking through the air. Clara felt the familiar sting of his contempt, a constant companion throughout her 20 years of service. Her own reflection in the polished silver serving tray showed only a ghost of a woman, her eyes betraying the weariness etched onto her soul. A flicker of something akin to recognition, perhaps even kinship, crossed her eyes when she caught sight of Julian, Reginald's son. He watched his father with a mixture of simmering resentment and undisguised disgust, his gaze lingering on Clara with a troubling intensity. There was a shared weariness in his eyes, a flicker of something akin to sadness that mirrored her own internal landscape. He saw past the composed facade, into the depths of her quiet dignity, the same quiet dignity he lacked the courage to openly show in defiance of his cruel father. Later, the party reached its crescendo. Reginald, fueled by champagne and ego, singled out Clara. His words, laced with venom, pierced the celebratory din. The humiliation was public, brutal, a calculated display of dominance. Clara's carefully constructed composure crumbled, but her silent tears were lost in the cacophony of laughter and clinking glasses. Only Julian, his face a mask of fury, registered the full brutality of his father's actions. He felt the silent plea in her eyes, a shared burden of unspoken secrets, a silent promise to seek justice. The night was far from over. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and a storm was brewing. The ballroom's glittering chandeliers cast long, dancing shadows, highlighting the dust motes swirling in the air like tiny, frantic stars. Julian excused himself from a suffocating conversation about offshore accounts, the hollow laughter of the guests a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. He found Clara by a secluded window, her back ramrod straight, meticulously polishing a silver tray. The faint scent of lavender clung to her, a stark counterpoint to the heavy perfume of the other women. He watched her for a long moment, his heart aching with a sympathy so profound it felt almost physical. He'd seen the way his father had looked at her, a mixture of contempt and something else, something darker, something possessive. It had been a look Julian had seen directed at others, but on Clara it felt different, more primal. He cleared his throat. Clara flinched, her hand pausing mid-stroke. Her eyes, the same deep brown as his own, met his, registering surprise before carefully settling into a composed neutrality. "Miss Clara," he began, his voice barely a whisper above the murmur of the party. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He wanted to offer her some comfort, some solace, but the chasm of their vastly different lives felt unbridgeable. She nodded, her expression unchanging. "Mr. Worthington, can I talk to you?" He gestured vaguely towards a deserted alcove. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Can I trust you? Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the ballroom, where his father's booming laughter echoed. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she followed him. The silence in the alcove was a stark contrast to the party's raucous energy. The only sound was the gentle thrum of the music filtering through the closed doors. I saw what happened," Julian began, the words tumbling out in a rush. He felt the heat rising in his cheeks, a mixture of shame and anger. "My father, he was cruel." Clara didn't speak, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the dim light. It was a tear not of self-pity, but of weary resignation, a lifetime of suppressed emotion finally finding its release. The sight broke something inside Julian. This silent acknowledgement of shared pain forged a silent bond between them. He knew in that instant that he had to act. He had to uncover the truth. The weight of that decision, the enormity of the task ahead, settled heavily on his shoulders. But he also felt a flicker of something else, hope. A tiny, fragile spark of hope in the suffocating darkness. The alcove, dimly lit by a single flickering sconce, smelled of dust and old velvet. Julian felt the weight of his father's cruelty pressing down on him, a physical burden he could almost taste. Clara, her usually impeccable composure fractured, sat rigidly on a plush velvet chaise lounge, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence between them crackled with unspoken accusations and shared pain. I've ordered a DNA test," Julian blurted, the words tumbling out in a rush. He watched her face, searching for any sign of comprehension. Her eyes, usually so calm and steady, widened slightly. A flicker of something, fear, hope, danced within their depths. Clara's silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic pulse of the distant music, a mocking counterpoint to the turmoil raging within the alcove. The faint scent of lavender, usually a comforting presence, now felt almost suffocating, clinging to the air like a shroud. "Whose?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the throbbing bass. The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Julian swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "Yours and my father's." He met her gaze, bracing himself for her reaction. He expected anger, disbelief, perhaps even fear. But what he saw in her eyes was something far more complex. A deep-seated weariness, a lifetime of suppressed emotion threatening to spill over. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow, glistening path down her cheek. He reached out a hand, hesitant, unsure. He stopped just short of touching her, afraid of intruding on her grief, her solitude. The gesture, however, seemed to break the spell. Clara took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping slightly as if releasing the weight of years. The silence returned, less heavy now, imbued with a fragile understanding. I've always suspected," she murmured, her voice still hushed but stronger now. "Small things, similarities, things my father wouldn't appreciate anyone noticing." She traced a finger along the edge of the velvet chaise, her eyes distant, lost in memories. The air hung thick with the unspoken, shared pasts, hidden truths, a lifetime of pain, and a tentative spark of hope. The weight of the secret, once a burden shared by only Clara, was now subtly, tentatively, shared between her and Julian. The DNA test, a simple procedure, represented the beginning of a journey into a past that promised to shake their lives to their very core. The champagne flutes clinked, a brittle symphony against the backdrop of Reginald's booming laughter. Crystal chandeliers glittered, casting a cold, impersonal light on the opulent ballroom. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, felt suffocating to Clara. She moved through the throng of elegantly dressed guests, a ghost in a crisp white uniform, her movements precise and almost mechanical. Each carefully placed hors d'oeuvre, each refilled champagne glass, was a silent act of defiance against the simmering humiliation that threatened to boil over. Reginald, a mountain of a man with a face etched with cruel indulgence, surveyed his domain with a predatory gaze. His laughter, punctuated by sharp, dismissive words, echoed through the room. He hadn't noticed her yet, but she felt his presence like a physical weight, a constant threat hanging over her. The music swelled, a vibrant, almost frantic pulse that mirrored the anxiety churning in Clara's stomach. She felt a tremor in her hand as she carefully polished a silver tray, her reflection shimmering faintly in the polished surface, a fleeting glimpse of a face remarkably similar to the man who held court across the room. The resemblance, usually buried deep beneath years of servitude and self-effacement, pricked at her, a phantom pain she'd learned to ignore. A stray strand of her perfectly coiffed hair escaped its confines. With a sigh that went unnoticed, she tucked it behind her ear, the gesture almost imperceptible. Julian, Reginald's son, observed from the shadows of a nearby alcove. His face was grim, his usually sharp features softened by a growing sense of unease. He watched his father, his revulsion almost palpable, a dark storm brewing in his eyes. The sight of Clara, so poised, so dignified in the face of such blatant disrespect, only fueled his silent fury. He noticed the way she moved, her grace a stark contrast to the boisterous revelry around her. The way she held herself, the quiet strength in her posture. Something about her, a subtle elegance in her movements, a certain intelligence that shone through her carefully controlled demeanor, struck a chord within him. It was a silent rebellion, a quiet dignity that resonated deeply with his own growing sense of discontent. He watched as Reginald, in a cruel display of power, deliberately spilled a glass of champagne onto Clara's pristine uniform. The laughter of the guests, sharp and cruel, pierced the air. Julian's jaw clenched. This was it, the final straw. He couldn't bear to watch his father crush her spirit any longer. He slipped away unnoticed, his mind already racing with a plan, a desperate, almost reckless attempt to uncover the truth. A truth that he sensed was buried somewhere deep within the opulent facade of his father's life. The stain spread, a dark blossom on Clara's pristine white uniform. The champagne, icy and sharp, stung her skin. She didn't flinch, didn't react, only lowered her gaze, her hands carefully blotting at the fabric with a linen napkin. The laughter of the guests washed over her, a cruel tide. Inside, a cold knot tightened in her chest, a familiar ache. She'd endured this casual disregard, this deliberate humiliation, for years. Reginald, his face flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, roared with laughter. "Clumsy, aren't we, Clara? Perhaps you're not cut out for this life of luxury," he boomed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. His words, barbed and cruel, were meant to sting. They did, but somehow less than they once had. A quiet defiance, a flicker of something akin to hope, stirred within her. Julian watched, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles shone white. The opulent ballroom, usually a symbol of his father's power, felt suffocating. He saw the subtle way Clara's shoulders stiffened, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. He saw the control she exerted, the quiet dignity that radiated from her even under this blatant assault. It was a strength he'd never noticed before, hidden beneath layers of subservience. He saw something else too, a shared melancholy in her eyes, a depth that mirrored a sadness he himself felt too often. The striking resemblance to his father, brushed aside so many times before, felt suddenly impossible to ignore. The same high cheekbones, the same strong jawline, the same dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of unspoken sorrows. Leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom, Julian slipped into his father's study. The air here was thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigars. His father's presence was everywhere, a palpable weight in the heavy silence. He moved swiftly, his fingers tracing the mahogany surface of his father's desk, searching for anything that might help him. A discarded shaving brush, a half-empty glass of whiskey, a crumpled napkin stained with a DNA sample. His gaze fell upon it. A thought, wild and dangerous, struck him. A chance, however slim, to uncover the truth. He'd finally find out what he intuitively felt. His father had always been cruel. But was it just cruelty? Or something far, far worse? The weight of the question pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket in the otherwise luxurious, silent room. He knew what he had to do. The study, usually a sanctuary of hushed power, felt claustrophobic. Julian's breath hitched in his throat, the scent of old leather and stale cigar smoke suddenly cloying. He stared at the crumpled napkin, the faint, almost invisible stain a tiny beacon in the dim light. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it. A reckless gamble. A desperate act born of suspicion and a burgeoning certainty that chilled him to the bone. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling. The sterile voice of the laboratory technician felt oddly distant, a jarring contrast to the turmoil raging within him. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's about the sample I submitted. I need the results. Urgent." The days that followed stretched into an eternity, each hour a lead weight dragging him down. Sleep eluded him. The image of Clara's quiet dignity, her haunted eyes, haunted his dreams. He replayed the scene from the party, the champagne, the cruel laughter, the unspoken sorrow in her gaze. The resemblance to his father, once a fleeting thought, now screamed at him from every shadowed corner of his memory. Finally, the call came. The technician's voice, measured and professional, delivered the verdict with brutal efficiency. Julian gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. The words echoed in his ears, a shattering revelation. The DNA results confirm a 99% probability of a sibling relationship. The weight of that information pressed down on him, crushing him under its immense gravity. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a dizzying mixture of shock, horror, and a strange, unsettling sense of relief. The truth, so long hidden, had finally surfaced, ugly and undeniable. He had to tell Clara. He found her in the servants' quarters, a small, sparsely furnished room that felt a world away from the opulent grandeur of his father's mansion. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, unsure of how to break the news. The quiet dignity he'd seen at the party was gone, replaced by a weariness that etched deep lines around her eyes. She looked up, startled by his presence, and her expression shifted to a guarded wariness. "Mr. Julian?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. He swallowed, the words catching in his throat. "Clara," he began, his voice trembling. I need to tell you something." The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, a silent plea for understanding, for mercy. The air crackled with unspoken emotion. The truth hung between them, heavy and inescapable. He knew this was just the beginning. The servants' quarters smelled faintly of lavender and old wood polish, a stark contrast to the opulent sense of Reginald's mansion. Clara, seated by a small, chipped table, meticulously mended a tear in a linen tablecloth. The soft light from a single lamp cast long shadows, highlighting the weariness etched into her face. Julian's words hung in the air, unspoken, a heavy weight between them. He watched her, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and dawning understanding. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and unnatural in the quiet room. "Clara," he began again, his voice thick with emotion. "The DNA test, it's conclusive." She looked up, her eyes wide, reflecting the lamplight like trapped stars. A flicker of apprehension, quickly masked by practiced calm, crossed her features. "Conclusive, sir?" she asked, her voice a low, controlled murmur. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "There's a very high probability that you are my father's sister." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile piece of the room. Clara's hands stilled, the needle frozen mid-stitch. Her breath hitched, a soft gasp barely audible above the rhythmic ticking. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her face devoid of expression. Then, a single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of disbelief, of a lifetime of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. The carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbled. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Julian approached cautiously, his steps hesitant. He didn't know what to say, how to comfort her, how to bridge the chasm of years and unspoken pain that lay between them. He simply knelt beside her, his hand hovering over hers, offering a silent gesture of support, of understanding. The scent of lavender intensified, mingling with the metallic tang of fear in the air. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them both, a shared burden of a lifetime's hidden truth. This was only the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards healing and justice. The truth, once a whispered secret, now cast a long shadow over their lives. The heavy oak door creaked shut, leaving Clara alone in the suffocating silence of her small room. The lavender scent, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, a suffocating reminder of her years of servitude. Julian's words echoed in her ears, a dissonant symphony of disbelief and terror. Sister? To him, the man who had treated her with such casual cruelty for decades. The thought was absurd, yet a strange, unsettling familiarity resonated deep within her. A buried memory, a flicker of a shared childhood, surfaced, a fleeting image of fire, of screams, of being separated from someone. She touched the worn, wooden cross hanging around her neck, its rough surface a familiar comfort. The simple silver pendant had been her only possession from before she couldn't remember, before Reginald, before the endless cycle of humiliation and quiet endurance. A sob escaped her lips, a sound choked back for too long. The dam had broken. Years of pent-up grief, fear, and resentment spilled out, a torrent of emotion that threatened to drown her. She sank to her knees, the worn rug offering little comfort against the cold, polished floor. A soft knock sounded on the door. Hesitantly, she called out, "Yes." Julian's voice, hesitant and full of concern, responded, "Clara, can I come in?" She managed a shaky breath. "Yes, please." The door opened slowly, revealing Julian standing in the doorway, his face etched with worry. He held a glass of water in his hand, his fingers nervously tightening around the glass. The lamplight glinted off the silver cufflinks on his shirt, a stark contrast to the simple elegance of Clara's worn dress. He entered cautiously, his footsteps quiet on the worn floorboards. He approached her slowly, offering the water. "Please, drink," he whispered, his voice filled with genuine concern. "You need to." Clara looked up at him, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed. Yet there was a dawning glimmer of something else, hope, perhaps? A flicker of something akin to recognition. "Sir," she whispered, her voice raspy with emotion. "It can't be true." Julian sat beside her, his hand gently resting on hers. He looked into her eyes, searching for an answer, a confirmation. But what he saw wasn't denial. He saw a woman confronting a lifetime of buried truth, a woman finally allowed to feel. The weight of the revelation hung heavily between them, but now it was a shared weight, a shared journey. The opulent ballroom shimmered, a kaleidoscope of swirling silks and glittering jewels. Champagne flutes clinked, a constant, brittle melody against the murmur of conversation. But Clara, perched precariously on a gilded chair tucked away in a shadowed corner, felt only the suffocating weight of the air, thick with the cloying scent of lilies and unspoken malice. The music, a vibrant waltz, felt discordant, a mockery of the turmoil brewing within her. Julian's words, "Sister," echoed in her ears, a phantom limb of disbelief. Reginald, resplendent in a tailored tuxedo, held court near the grand fireplace, his laughter a cruel, brittle sound that cut through the glittering facade. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept the room, pausing momentarily on Clara, a predatory glint in their depths. The humiliation hadn't been subtle. It had been a deliberate public display of his power, a calculated act of cruelty designed to break her spirit. Yet, strangely, the realization of their possible kinship infused a new, terrifying energy into her quiet despair. Fear warred with a nascent hope, a fragile seedling pushing through the hardened ground of years of silent suffering. Julian found her later, in the nearly deserted conservatory. Moonlight spilled through the arched windows, casting long, dramatic shadows that danced across the lush foliage. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth and exotic blooms, a stark contrast to the opulent ballroom. He moved towards her with a hesitant grace, his face etched with concern. "Clara," he began, his voice low and careful. I need to know, is there anything you remember? Anything at all from your childhood?" She looked at him, her eyes wide and unfocused, searching for an anchor in the storm raging within. The years melted away, leaving a fragile, fragmented memory of warmth, of laughter, of a shared crib, and then the searing heat, the roar of flames, the screams, a chaotic jumble of terror and disorientation. "Fire," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a tremor running through her frail frame. "I remember fire." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. The simple act of remembering, of allowing herself to feel, was both terrifying and liberating. The truth, however monstrous, was a crack in the wall of silence she had built around her heart. She looked up at Julian, his face illuminated by the moonlight, a reflection of her own dawning hope. It was a fragile hope, a tentative step into the unknown, but it was hope nonetheless. And in that shared space of vulnerability, a bond, as strong and as fragile as newly sprouted life, began to bloom. The conservatory air hung heavy with the scent of jasmine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the suffocating opulence of the ballroom. Moonlight, filtering through the arched windows, painted the lush greenery in silver and shadow. Clara, huddled on a wicker bench, felt the chill seep into her bones despite the warmth of Julian's presence. He sat beside her, a respectful distance maintained, his concern palpable. The memory of fire, a searing brand on her soul, continued to flicker behind her eyes. It's all coming back," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words felt alien, foreign, like a forgotten language suddenly resurrected. Each syllable was a painful excavation of buried memories. The shared crib, the warmth of a sibling's presence, the laughter, and then the inferno, the screams, the agonizing disorientation. Julian reached out, his hand hovering near hers. He hesitated, then gently clasped her fingers, his touch surprisingly comforting. "It's all right, Clara," he murmured, his voice a soothing balm. "Take your time. There's no need to rush." The weight of decades of silence began to lift, replaced by a torrent of fragmented images. A woman's face, blurred and indistinct, but radiating a familiar warmth. A shared lullaby, humming on the edge of recollection. The overwhelming terror of the fire, the agonizing separation. Tears streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. I remember a woman," Clara choked out, her voice thick with emotion. "Beautiful, kind eyes, a gentle smile, but then, darkness." She shuddered, the memory of the flames too vivid, too brutal. The scent of burning wood and singed hair invaded her senses, a phantom smell clinging to the edges of her memory. Julian squeezed her hand, offering silent comfort. "We'll find out," he promised, his voice firm yet gentle. "We'll find out everything. We'll uncover the truth." The weight of his words hung between them, a shared commitment, a promise of justice, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The DNA results were a confirmation, a cruel twist of fate, but they were also a key to unlocking a past shrouded in mystery and pain. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a flicker of hope, fragile yet tenacious. A tiny flame that burned brightly against the encroaching darkness. The ballroom, a cavernous space glittering with chandeliers and overflowing with champagne flutes, felt miles away. The conservatory, a sanctuary of green and glass, offered a fragile respite. Clara shivered, not entirely from the cool night air. The memory of Reginald's sneering face, his public humiliation, still burned hotter than any fire. Julian watched her, his heart aching. He'd seen the quiet dignity she'd maintained, even under such blatant cruelty, and that had fueled his resolve. He reached for her hand again, this time his touch lingering. Clara flinched, a lifetime of ingrained fear momentarily surfacing before melting away under the warmth of his gentle pressure. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words catching in her throat. The apology wasn't for the humiliation, not directly. It was for the years of silence, of swallowed pain, of pretending. The scent of jasmine, usually calming, felt cloying, suffocating. Each petal seemed to mock her quiet endurance, her years of unspoken suffering. Julian squeezed her hand. "It wasn't your fault, Clara," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "None of it was." The weight of the DNA results hung between them, unspoken yet undeniably present. The revelation had shattered Julian's world, but seeing Clara's reaction, her quiet unraveling, had intensified his resolve tenfold. He had to protect her, to right the wrongs of the past. "The fire," Clara began, her voice trembling. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken trauma. She closed her eyes, the images flooding back, a chaotic swirl of flames, screams, and the searing heat, the memory of a woman's face, a fleeting glimpse of kindness amidst the terror, pierced through the haze of decades-old repression. Julian remained silent, letting her gather her thoughts, her memories. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, that the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles. But he was determined to walk it with her, to face Reginald's wrath, to uncover the truth, and to ensure that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. The fragile hope that had begun to bloom within Clara, a tiny seedling pushing through years of hardened soil, was a testament to their shared resilience, a promise of a future where the truth would set them free. The conservatory's glass roof shimmered, reflecting the party's still vibrant glow. Outside, the city hummed a low, discordant tune, a stark contrast to the hushed intimacy of their refuge. Clara, nestled amongst the lush ferns, felt the chill seep into her bones, a physical manifestation of the emotional ice that had encased her for decades. The scent of jasmine, usually soothing, now felt oppressive, a suffocating reminder of the opulent cage she'd inhabited. Julian watched her, his own unease mirroring hers. The DNA results, a stark white sheet clutched in his pocket, felt heavier than any physical burden. He'd seen the quiet dignity she displayed throughout Reginald's cruelties, a resilience that had both horrified and inspired him. Now, seeing her unravel, the years of carefully constructed composure crumbling, brought a fierce protectiveness to the forefront. "The fire," Clara whispered, her voice a mere breath against the rustling leaves. The word hung in the air, charged with unspoken trauma. Tears welled, blurring the already hazy memories. Fragments of smoke, screams, a searing heat, a woman's face, fleeting, kind, a beacon in the inferno. Julian reached for her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. The contact sparked a jolt through her, a flicker of warmth in the icy landscape of her memories. He saw the tremor that ran through her, a physical manifestation of the decades of repressed fear. "It all comes back to that fire, doesn't it?" he said softly, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump forming in her throat. The weight of the years of the unspoken truth pressed down on her, heavier than any physical burden. The opulent ballroom, the champagne flutes, the glittering lights all felt distant, unreal, compared to the visceral reality of that fire, of the separation, of the life she'd never known. Julian squeezed her hand. "We'll find out what happened," he promised, his voice firm despite the tremor of his own unease. "We'll find out the truth." The unspoken promise hung between them. A promise of justice, a promise of healing, a promise of a future where the truth would finally set them free. A future where the cruelties of the past couldn't dim the flame of their shared hope. The scent of jasmine, still heavy in the air, now seemed to carry a hint of something sweeter, something akin to hope. The fragile seedling of hope continued to push through the hardened soil. The champagne flutes, abandoned mid-clink, reflected the harsh glare of the conservatory lights. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of jasmine and the lingering scent of spilled wine, felt suddenly suffocating. Clara, her usual composure shattered, trembled, the silk of her uniform clinging uncomfortably to her damp skin. Julian, watching her, felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. He'd seen his father's cruelty, but witnessing its impact on Clara, the quiet dignity buckling under the weight of decades of suppressed trauma, was a different kind of horror. The fire, it was a blur, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant strains of music. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, were stained crimson from the spilled wine, a stark contrast to the pristine white of her gloves. Each trembling breath hitched in her chest, a visible struggle against the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. I remember flashes, she continued, her voice cracking. Smoke, heat, screaming, and a woman, a face, kind. The words tumbled out, fragmented, incomplete, like shattered pieces of a precious vase. Her eyes, wide and haunted, searched Julian's face, seeking solace, understanding, perhaps even confirmation. Julian reached for her hand again, his touch gentle but firm. He saw the muscles in her jaw clench, a silent battle against the tide of emotions threatening to consume her. He felt the tremor in her hand, a silent scream echoing the unspoken pain. Tell me what you remember, he urged, his voice low and reassuring. He felt the weight of his promise, the weight of the truth, settle heavily on his shoulders. He had to help her, not just to expose his father's cruelty, but to help her find a life free from the shadow of that terrible fire. The DNA results were only the beginning, a key to unlocking a past that had scarred them both, in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The opulent setting, the shimmering crystal, the oblivious revelers, all seemed to fade into insignificance, replaced by the stark reality of the fire, the separation, the decades of lost time and unspoken pain. The truth was a burning ember, waiting to ignite a conflagration that would consume Reginald's empire and, perhaps, set Clara free. The conservatory's opulent chill seeped into Clara's bones, a stark contrast to the fiery images flickering behind her eyelids. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating, mirroring the constriction in her chest. Julian's hand, warm and surprisingly strong, offered a fragile lifeline. She squeezed it, the dampness of her palm a testament to her inner turmoil. The woman, she had kind eyes, she whispered, the words catching in her throat like shards of glass. Memories, fragmented and unreliable, surfaced in fleeting glimpses. A crib engulfed in flames, the acrid stench of smoke, the desperate cries of a child. Then, nothing. A vast, agonizing blankness spanning decades. Julian's grip tightened. He saw the raw fear etched on her face, the haunted look in her eyes, a reflection of the pain that had shaped her life. A pain he now understood in a way he never could have before. It's all right, he murmured, his voice barely a breath. You don't have to remember everything at once. The music from the main ballroom pulsed faintly, a jarring counterpoint to the quiet intensity of their shared grief. He saw the subtle tremor in her hand, the way her breath hitched, a silent plea for understanding. There was a necklace, she managed, her voice barely a thread. Silver, a tiny bird, a charm. The image, sharp and clear, pierced the fog of her forgotten past. A single, precious detail that held the promise of a connection, a bridge across the chasm of lost time. Julian felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to help her reclaim her past. He leaned closer, his gaze unwavering. We'll find out, he promised, his voice firm. We'll find out everything. He felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him, heavier than the burden of his father's vast fortune. This wasn't just about exposing Reginald's cruelty anymore. This was about restoring Clara's life, about helping her reclaim her stolen identity. The champagne flutes, still scattered like fallen stars across the polished marble floor, seemed to mock the fragility of their situation, the precariousness of the truth they were about to unveil. The air hung heavy with unspoken emotions, fear, hope, and the quiet promise of a long-overdue reckoning. The champagne bubbles clung to the rim of Clara's glass, mirroring the unsteady tremor in her hand. The opulence of the ballroom, usually a source of muted dread, now felt like a suffocating cage. Each glittering chandelier seemed to cast a judgmental eye on her, amplifying the humiliation that still clung to her like a shroud. Julian, sensing her distress, gently took her arm, his touch surprisingly comforting. The cool marble beneath her fingers offered a small solace against the heat rising in her cheeks. "They don't know," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against the muted strains of the orchestra. "They don't know what happened." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted. The memory of Reginald's sneering face, the cruel laughter of his guests, still echoed in her ears. The scent of expensive perfume and spilled wine was a nauseating reminder of the public degradation she had endured. The weight of decades of silent suffering pressed down on her, a crushing burden. "But they will," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "They will find out." The thought of the truth shattering Reginald's meticulously crafted facade sent a shiver down her spine. Julian squeezed her arm, offering silent reassurance. He led her away from the still-buzzing ballroom, towards the relative quiet of the conservatory. The air here was thick with the scent of lilies and damp earth, a stark contrast to the cloying sweetness of the champagne. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant city hum. He pulled up a plush velvet chair and gently guided her to sit. The softness of the fabric was strangely comforting against her trembling body. He sat beside her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears and burgeoning hope. "The test, it's not just about him," he said, his voice laced with a determination that surprised even him. "It's about you, about finding out who you are." Clara looked at him, a flicker of something akin to hope igniting in her eyes. The years of silent endurance had etched lines of weariness onto her face, but underneath, Julian saw a spark of resilience, a strength he hadn't noticed before. The truth, once revealed, would not just dismantle Reginald's empire. It would shatter the foundations of her own carefully constructed life. But in the quiet intensity of that shared moment, amidst the opulence and deceit, a new dawn seemed to be breaking. The possibility of reclaiming a stolen identity, of finally knowing the truth, was a fragile flame, but it was a flame nonetheless. The conservatory offered a fragile respite. The scent of lilies, heavy and sweet, battled the lingering perfume of the ballroom, a cloying reminder of the humiliation. Clara's trembling hand clutched Julian's arm, the coolness of the marble floor a stark contrast to the burning shame she felt. Outside, the city hummed a distant, melancholic tune. "It was deliberate," Clara finally whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Every slight, every cruel word. It wasn't just bad luck. A single tear traced a path through the carefully applied makeup, a stark line against her perfectly composed facade. Julian squeezed her hand, his own knuckles white. He felt the tremor in her body, a silent testament to the years of suppressed rage and sorrow. "I know," he murmured, his voice thick with anger he couldn't quite unleash. "I saw it, the way he looked at you, the way he enjoyed it." Silence descended, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves outside. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket of shared understanding. The opulence of Reginald's world, once a symbol of power and success, now felt like a grotesque mockery. He never acknowledged me," Clara continued, her voice barely a breath. "Never a kind word, not even a glance of recognition. Only orders, demands, as if I were nothing." She swallowed hard, fighting back the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Julian watched her, his heart aching with a mixture of pity and burgeoning rage. The carefully constructed image of his father crumbled further with each whispered confession. The man he knew, the powerful billionaire, was nothing more than a cruel, heartless tyrant. And this woman, this quiet, dignified maid, was a victim of his cruelty. A victim he was beginning to suspect, with a far deeper connection to his father than anyone could have ever imagined. The DNA results, still sealed in the envelope in his pocket, felt heavy with the weight of a truth about to shatter their world. "It ends tonight," he vowed silently, his gaze hardening. The game was on. The cool night air offered little solace as Julian walked the manicured grounds of his father's estate. The scent of damp earth and clipped hedges did nothing to soothe the turmoil inside him. His pockets felt heavy, the sealed envelope a physical manifestation of the seismic shift about to occur. He stopped, the ornate fountain a shimmering backdrop to his internal conflict. He'd seen the disgust in Clara's eyes, the subtle flinch at his father's touch, a mirrored reaction to his own revulsion. The DNA results felt less like evidence and more like a grenade, poised to obliterate everything he'd ever known. He pulled out his phone, the screen's cold light illuminating his drawn face. He needed time, a moment of quiet before he faced Clara again, before he confronted his father. He scrolled through old family photos, his finger lingering on a faded picture of a young boy, his father. Maybe? The resemblance to Clara was uncanny. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline. The photographs only confirmed what his gut already knew. Something was terribly wrong, and it ran far deeper than simple cruelty. He found himself drawn back to the conservatory, its glass walls reflecting the city's glittering lights like captured stars. He found Clara perched on a marble bench, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The lilies' scent hung heavy, a fragile perfume masking the stench of betrayal. I've had the results," Julian began, his voice barely a whisper in the hushed elegance of the room. He watched as a ripple of fear crossed her face, quickly replaced by a guarded stillness. Clara's gaze was unwavering, her eyes pools of shadowed emotion. "Yes?" she breathed, the single word heavy with unspoken anticipation. He handed her the envelope, his own hands trembling. The simple act felt monumental, the weight of the truth pressing down on them both. Clara's fingers brushed against the crisp paper. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the vast house. He saw the moment her composure fractured, a single tear escaping, tracing a fragile path down her cheek. It was a tear not just of sorrow, but of a dawning realization, a flicker of long-dormant hope. The truth, both devastating and liberating, was finally within reach. The game, as he'd vowed, had begun. Clara's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. The crisp paper crackled, a sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the conservatory. The lilies, usually fragrant, felt cloying, their sweetness a mocking counterpoint to the bitter truth unfolding. Julian watched, his heart a trapped bird fluttering against his ribs. The results, typed in stark, clinical language, were undeniable. A shared DNA profile, a connection forged in fire and lost in the chaos of a childhood catastrophe. A single tear escaped Clara's eye, tracing a slow path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the fine dusting of powder on her skin. She didn't cry out, didn't collapse. Instead, she sat, utterly still, the fragile porcelain of her composure threatening to shatter. The weight of decades of silent endurance, of unspoken longing, seemed to press down on her, visible in the slump of her shoulders, the tremor in her hands. It can't be," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the fountain outside. The words felt distant, unreal, yet the truth resonated in the deep ache in her eyes. Julian reached out, his hand hovering over hers, unsure if he dared to touch. He saw the fear warring with something else, a fragile ember of hope sparking amidst the ashes of her past. "It is," Julian confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "It's your father, my father. He's your twin." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their unspoken implications. The revelation wasn't just a biological fact. It was a seismic shift that threatened to rearrange their lives, to topple Reginald's empire, and to shatter the illusion of order that had governed their existence. Clara finally looked up, her gaze meeting Julian's. It wasn't a gaze of anger or accusation, but of profound sadness, of a lifetime spent in shadows, finally illuminated by a harsh but undeniable light. She felt a strange mixture of terror and relief, the possibility of a past she'd only dimly remembered, a family she'd only ever glimpsed in fleeting moments, now suddenly within her reach. The bitter taste of injustice mingled with a tentative sweetness, a nascent sense of possibility. The scent of lilies intensified, a suffocating sweetness, yet she found herself strangely comforted. The conservatory, a place of hidden secrets, had become a sanctuary, a silent witness to the unveiling of a truth that had been buried for decades. The future remained uncertain, treacherous even, but for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a flicker of hope, a fragile spark ignited in the heart of darkness. The game had begun, and she was ready to play. The news hung between them, a tangible thing, thick and heavy as the humid conservatory air. Clara, still pale, traced the rim of her teacup, the fine bone china cold against her fingertips. The scent of lilies, once cloying, now seemed to fade, replaced by the metallic tang of fear. Outside, the party raged on, oblivious to the earthquake rumbling beneath their meticulously manicured lawns. "What do we do?" she finally whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. The question hung unspoken, yet both understood its weight. The potential collapse of Reginald's empire, the legal battles to come, the public scrutiny, the utter upheaval of their lives. Julian, his own exhaustion etched deep into his face, watched her. He saw the tremor in her hand, the way her breath hitched in her chest. He understood her fear, felt it mirroring his own. "We need time," he said, his voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the storm brewing within them. Time to plan, to gather evidence, the weight of decades of repressed memories, of unspoken pain, threatened to... Reginald finally looked up, his eyes narrowed, suspicious. "Clara? What?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need the fire. It wasn't an accident," Julian stated, his voice low but firm. Clara felt a wave of dizziness, the sheer volume of noise and accusation threatening. Clara focused on the steady pressure of Julian's hand, a lifeline in the swirling after. Julian pulled her closer, the warmth of his embrace a stark contrast to the chill of... The news hung between... The fine bone china lilies, once cloying, now seemed placed by the metallic tang. Raged on, a meticulously manicured lawn. He whispered, her voice leaves. The question both understood its weight. The potential color, the legal battles to come, the lives. Julian etched deep into his fur. He saw the tremor in her hand. "Need time," he said, low and steady. "Time to plan." Of decades of repressed spoken pain, threatened to... Reginald... Sarah? What? Felt a wave of dizziness. Threatening. Clara... A lifeline in... pulled her closer to the chill of... now seemed raged on a meticulously manicured lawn. Whispered, her voice the legal battle lives. Julian low and steady. Felt a wave of dizziness. Threatening. Clara low and steady. Threatening. Clara